This is the Dallas Morning News.
Hello, everybody. Welcome into SportsDay Insider, presented by the Dallas Morning News. I am Kevin Sherrington, joined by my pal, Evan Grant. David Moore is not with us today. He is out at the Super Bowl, or at least on his way out there. He's having a lot of fun doing that. You know, I've done those Super Bowls. I got to tell you, they're kind of a boondoggle. It just feels like as the media, we're just being herded from one thing to the next. You know, it's like feeding them at the trough.
Moo.
That's it. Yeah, that's us.
But you know what? There's snacks at the end. There's always snacks and good food. So we're just happy to move along. Move along, people. The shrimp cocktail is down here.
The media, that's what the media is to everybody. It's just cattle. Just move them along.
Look, the Super Bowl it's more culture than it is a sporting event at this point in time. When we had the Super Bowl here and we had Radio Row downtown, and I got to kind of do the post-game interviews after the ticket had their hosts on the air, had their guests on the air, and we aired that kind of on our YouTube channel. That was fun for me, but the idea of trying to cover the football game, I think, is just exceptionally difficult. It's you have no access really to the players. Anytime that you have an opportunity to interview players, somebody's more likely to ask, who do you like more, Dochi or Kendrick Lamar? You just don't get anything where you can actually cover the football game. So it's, in a lot of ways, it's defeating for the media, I think.
Yeah, I can remember being at the Superdome in the 80s and covering the Super Bowl. The 49ers were in it. And after the game, going down straight to the locker room after the game and going up and talking to Joe Montana in his locker with four other guys.
That's because you're a fossil, Kevin.
No, that was the 80s. That wasn't that long ago.
Hey, speaking of which, do you know that last week Rangers VP or former VP John Blake did a caravan event where they went to this museum where they're preserving, or they found these fossils, these dinosaur bones? Did you see this?
No. They
did a Rangers caravan event at this museum. I might have been down in Waco where they were looking at dinosaur bones, and I saw John on Friday. And I said, well, look at that. They brought a fossil to go show off the fossils. I don't know if he really appreciated that.
That's a big setup for such a low delivery.
That's the thing about dad jokes, Kevin, is that I'm gonna
if you can turn it
hit
fast,
you over the head with it.
If you can turn it over fast, it's one thing, but that was way too far to go. All right, let's get going here. Let's talk about what everybody wants to talk about.
Yeah, let's talk about sports.
Holy cow. It is a SportsDay Insider podcast.
Anything happen in sports this week, Kevin?
Yeah, I tell you. When I was just got in bed. It was like 11:30, and my phone's dinging like crazy. And I go over there and look at it, and a little bit of a fog, and it says that the Mavericks have acquired Anthony Davis. And I thought, my gosh, how in the world did they get Anthony Davis? Who knew that was coming? Then I looked up at the top of the header and it said Luka Doncic. I thought,
who are the sources that you're following if the headline was Mavericks acquire Anthony Davis?
No, I just read the bottom part of it first.
Oh, okay.
And so then I saw that at the top, the message about Luka. Just an unbelievable development. It's one of those things that, people remember for the rest of their lives, right? Especially if you're a Dallas Mavericks fan and you just lost a generational player at 25, and he's no longer in the market. A guy that was drafted by the Mavericks, developed by the Mavericks, and was a star immediately, a 5-time first-team All-NBA player at 25. One of only 3 players ever to achieve that before the age of 26, Tim Duncan and Kevin Durant being the others. When you have people like Kevin Durant saying that this trade was insane, saying that publicly, a guy who knows Anthony Davis, knows how good a player Anthony Davis is, and is going to run into him all the time, would still say more than once, this was insane, this trade. I think that tells you all you need to know, right?
Yeah, I mean, I am still looking for the perspective or the column that basically says, okay, here's why the trade makes sense from the Mavericks perspective. I've yet to see that. I know there are elements of this that make some sense. Taking in a vacuum, and adding Anthony Davis in the defensive component, should make them a better team. But they've traded one of the 50 best players in NBA history, a guy who's 25. We're talking about conditioning issues, but you've traded for a guy who's played 60 games one time in a 10-year career. Like, none of the elements that should add up here add up for me, and I'm simply coming at it from as the ultimate outsider, but it doesn't make sense.
Well, here's how you have to look at it, in my mind, because obviously now all the conspiracy mongers are out there saying, that Patrick Dumont and the Adelsons are trying to devalue the team so that they can move it to Las Vegas and have it there because they're not going to get the casino here that they wanted, and all that stuff is just ridiculous. You don't spend $3.5 billion on something and devalue it. Not purposefully. You may do that inadvertently. I got an email from one of our faithful listeners who said that he laughed for about a mile when he listened to our podcast from last week. He listened to it yesterday about how we talked about what a great job that Nico Harrison was doing as a GM. So, things can change. It's a volatile situation. But, the thing about Nico, that going in, when he was hired, I felt like, oh, gosh, this guy's, at least from a personality standpoint, is in over his head. He was just so shy and withdrawn and not the kind of personality you would expect of a GM, right? You would expect him to be, fairly brash, and, certainly confident, knowing what they wanted to do, can present their cases well. That was not the case with Nico at all. So then, he goes out, and there was a couple of bad trades initially, but then he had two really good seasons in a row, starting with the Kyrie Irving one in that trade and how that worked out. And then at the trade deadline last year, when he added, Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington. And when both of those trades were ripped. Actually, all three of the trades were ripped, by the media here and nationally. And they all worked out exceedingly well, right? That they wouldn't have gotten to the NBA Finals last year without them. But I do think that what we have happened here is that he overrated what he did and underrated what Luka did. They can talk about that, well, some of Luka's numbers, the impact is not as great as you think it is. But the thing that always impressed me about Luka was even on days or nights when he was not shooting well, which he's not a great shooter. He's a bold shooter. He's not a great shooter. But he is the guy you want taking that shot with 5 seconds left in the game. That's the guy you want to take. He loves to take that shot. And those guys are hard to find. It's hard to find players who love the moment, that the more that fans are yelling at you and trying to intimidate you, and the other team is trying to intimidate you, he loves it even more. Those guys are exceedingly rare, and the Mavericks had that guy in their organization. Now, look, here's what they complained about. One, that
let's before you go into that, let's just stop here, right? Because we do need to acknowledge this. No player is perfect. Every player is going to have flaws. So, what, from the Mavericks' perspective, were the flaws in Luka's game before we weigh that against all the assets?
Well, that's what I was fixing to say. So number one, the fact that he was rarely in shape. He would go in, he might come into the season in shape because he has a team that works with him and all that kind of stuff. But then almost immediately, there's intimations that, he likes to have a beer. They're not saying he's a drunk. They're not saying any of that. He just likes to drink beer, and he doesn't eat properly, eats food that's not good for him, eats too much of it. Tim McMahon of ESPN reported that when he was out earlier this season, for extended time, and when they said it was a bad wrist, actually the deal was that he was completely out of shape and they were trying to get him back into playing shape. That's a really poor example for a 25-year-old guy. First of all, that a 25-year-old guy can be that out of shape is just kind of hard to believe. But that's a bad example. When you're the best player on the team, you need to be, and you're the highest paid player on the team, You need
if
to
you're
be the role
25
model
years
leader.
old and you literally cannot play the game because you're not in shape, that is a clearly and significantly troubling element. There's no doubt about that.
No question about that. And I'm with them 100% on that. And they were tired of it, right? They were tired of dealing with it year after year. You keep banging on this guy. Remember when Reggie Miller said on a national broadcast that Luka's out of shape? He was told that by the Mavericks Brain Trust. They said, listen, we would love it if you would say something about this on the air, right? They want that message out there. They were trying to embarrass Luka into getting in better shape. So that's a significant development there, especially on a team or on any team. To me, it goes back to the Juan Gonzalez thing, right? Juan Gonzalez was the highest paid player on the Rangers, an unbelievable talent. And we can talk about whether he was juiced or not, which he probably was, but he was a tremendous talent, but not a leader in the least. And when you're paying that much money to a person who's not doing the things that he needs to do to be a leader, to be a good example to the rest of the guys on the team, and to get them to follow him, that's not good. On this team, Kyrie Irving's the leader. There's no question about that. I wrote that before the trade when I wrote about Kyrie Irving last week.
But if we're using the Juan example, okay, there's a couple things here, right? The Rangers had gone to three division to the playoffs 3 times in 4 years with Juan. He had won MVP twice. They had not advanced past the first round, had won 1 game. And in 98 and 99 in the playoffs, he looked overmatched. Secondly, there were elements, particularly in 99 during the season at the Hall of Fame induction when he wouldn't play in the Hall of Fame game and he whined about the pants. And there were often times where the maintenance of Juan and making Juan happy was considered an issue. Okay. There were times when it felt like maybe he didn't want to play, and that was all an issue. But my point here is that the Mavericks succeeded with Luka. They went to the conference finals and then they went to the NBA finals. This was not a team where he didn't show up in the playoffs. Secondly, emotionally on the floor, he definitely, there were times when he was a distraction because of the whining, but there were times when he was an emotional leader with his shows of whether it was smack talk or just straight out emotion, where he fired that team up. And third, the thing that I'm still struggling with is we talk about how out of shape he was, and every time I watch Luka on the floor, he pretty much didn't look terribly athletic, but he performed. And I'm still troubled with this. I mean, if he couldn't play and the Mavericks made up an injury that he couldn't play, that's a significant issue. If he was just fat, but he played well when he was fat, if he was Bartolo Colon, it's indefensible because he went out there and he performed.
He performed, but not at the level they wanted him to. Look, here was the thing of the two-way part of this is that, when Luka was, when we don't talk about the barking at officials all the time, that bothered them, that he was constantly being distracted by the officials. And as Kid had said on several occasions, when you're turning and barking at the officials, now it's 5-on-4. Right. And that was an issue for them. It was an issue that Luka was a very crafty defender. He was a defender much like Jason Kidd was. Jason Kidd was not so great one-on-one. He was a great team defender. He saw the passing lanes from a defensive standpoint and stole a lot of passes and disrupted things. And Luka was very good at that. It's just that when you're out of shape and you put so much energy into your offense, then it's got to come from someplace else. And so it was coming from his defense. He wasn't always playing well. In the finals against Boston, the Celtics constantly went at Luka. I mean, whoever Luka was guarding, that's who they got the ball to. And then we saw what happened in the finals. It was just a joke. And at that point in the season, you played a lot of games, and you're exhausted at the end, right? And if you're not truly in shape and at the epitome of what you should be, then that becomes an issue. And to me, this is all, I don't have any problem with this argument. As I said before, it just doesn't rise to the level of trading him. All right, let's move to the second thing, and I just alluded to, was the defense. When people make the argument about who are the greatest players of all time, invariably they were always two-way players. They were people who played offense and defense. Luka can be an adequate defender. In no shape or form is he a great defender. And so this team that they've been trying to build, everything about it is built in a defensive vein. Everybody they've traded for is a defensive-minded player, except for Kyrie Irving. And Kyrie actually, for his size, is a pretty good defender, very active defender. So, and he certainly gives it a lot of effort, for what his physical limitations are as a player. So that was a second issue. I believe a smaller issue is the fact that they had the Supermax contract coming up this summer. It's going to cost them $325 million commitment to him, and yet he could still opt out after next season if he wanted to. Now, they tried to sell that, and that's the one thing I don't believe at all. I don't believe in any way that Luka was looking to leave. I think he likes it here. And we saw that there is a letter on the back page of the sports section of the Dallas Morning News today, a full page letter, in which he says that how much he loved playing here, coming here, the support of the fans. We didn't really know Luka all that well. He's very close to the vest, right? And when he talks at press conferences, and which is the only time you ever get to talk to him, the answers are very short and they're always the same. Something's amazing. Something was really good. This was fine. Or if he did something wrong, he'd say it was his fault. But very rarely did we ever feel like he was giving his true feelings about something. And I think that's what we saw on the floor, was that just the opening up of everything of who he was as a player. That was just all unleashed. He was a dog out there on the floor. There's no question about that. And that's what so many players loved about him, was that. And that's one of the things I loved about him, is that, he was never too small for the moment, always rose to the occasion. He may not have succeeded, but he was ready to take that moment. And that's such a rare thing to get. And so we can talk now about, so let's talk about, so those were the things that they felt like were issues with Luka. I do not think in any way, shape, or form, as I said before, that this was a matter of that they didn't want to pay him, or that they're trying to undermine the team so they can move it. None of that stuff's all ridiculous. Nico Harrison had success at the last two trade deadlines. That emboldened him both of those times, and he thought, we're getting Anthony Davis, a great two-way player. And there's no question about Anthony Davis's abilities, both as an offensive and defensive player. His availability has been something. Only once in the last 6 years has he played more than 62 games, and that was last year. He played 75 games last year. So, and he's going to be 32 next month. So, how many more years do you expect him to be really good? Well, Nico said we got, for me, the long-term future is 3 or 4 years from now. I don't think past that, which I like that thinking by a GM. That's the way he should be thinking, is not down the line too far to try to win. There are people out there who will tell you that they will be better set up now because they are a more conventional team now. The one thing about the makeup of this roster, it was a very unusual roster makeup, right? You had two centers who are basically around the rim centers, in Derek Lively, and then Daniel Gafford. Neither one of those guys is going to wander out anywhere and shoot a three. It was a big joke when Lively did that in the playoffs last year. So to have that kind of makeup, and then you had the two-headed point guard. Well, that's all the firepower was in the backcourt. There was none in the front court, none, except for you can talk about rolling to the basket, and they're getting lots of dunks that way, and all that stuff worked really well. And they worked.
Kevin, wait, I want to stop
well.
you for 1 second before you go too deep into this. I'm stuck on two things, right? And I just think it needs to be said that from my perspective, and again, considering this just from the baseball perspective or covering a baseball organization, there are two principles in this, in the summing up of what Luka didn't do well that stuck out with me. One is, I think the worst thing that baseball evaluators and evaluators in any sport can fall into is thinking about overweighing what guys don't do. Okay. we take into account all the things they don't do, and then take into account the things that you just mentioned about what Luka did do, particularly at the end of the game. And it's clear in my mind that the assets far outweigh the liabilities. The second thing is, you mentioned that, and I know where you're going with this, but you mentioned, that Nico had a good trade record on the last couple of deadlines, and he's made some good player moves. I certainly hope it's not a case in which Nico thought too highly of his moves, because I think the ultimate case of hubris that a GM or a coach can ever make is to think that they're the reason a team wins or loses. You win or lose because of talent. And I hope the GM here did not over-evaluate his value to this organization.
All right, just a minute ago, you wanted me to talk about what Anthony Davis brings to the team, and
No. Yeah, I want you to go back into that, but I'm just stuck on those two things.
I know we're going to get there. I just want to say really quickly about Anthony Davis and what he brings. So, look, they're going to be a more conventional team, right, than they were before. They're going to be a team now that can't. Anthony Davis is what he wants to do is he wants to play power forward and not center. Although he's only shooting 27% from threes this year, so that's not going to do it. But he certainly is an accomplished scorer. There's no question about it. Much, much more so than Daniel Gafford or Derek Lively. So if he's wanted to play next to a great center, so he doesn't have to do those things, and he's a great defensive player as well. So now their front court is as good as as Cleveland's. Cleveland has probably the best front court in the league, a big wall up there. Well, now the Mavericks have that, so they'll have this big wall up front. So there will be things about them that are very good, and they have played well at times without Luka, just not in the long term. So what's happened now is that their calendar to win, their window to win, has been shortened. Because Kyrie's in his 30s now, and Davis is 32. So we're talking about the next 3 or 4 years for these guys to win. Whereas with Luka, your window is 10 years or more, as long as he stayed healthy.
Well, but that's their question, right? Is that their bet here is that Luka's window is far lower, is far shorter than that.
I heard that a couple years ago. That's what they thought, that their window was shorter than everybody thinks because of his age. And so whether that's true or not, I don't know. Here's the thing I will talk about. And before we get into the whole, contract situation or the trading situation, is that, he's going to go out there now and play next to the biggest physical freak in the history of the NBA, except for maybe Wilt Chamberlain. I'm the only other guy that I could compare him to. LeBron James, who came into the league as an SUV, and he is still a high-powered SUV at 40-41. It's just an unbelievable what he has been able to do. And that is all the power to him, because he has worked so hard to keep himself at that level and to play like that. It's just been phenomenal. Well, now, if Luka doesn't learn something from LeBron playing next to him every night, and if LeBron doesn't hold him to that, if LeBron doesn't say, hey, man, you got to get in better shape here. Look, come to the gym with me. I'll work you out, and we'll get going here. If he harnesses that ability now by playing next to LeBron and see what he does, and then switches his lifestyle to that, well, Lord knows what he could be if he was in that kind of condition for the rest of his career.
All right, here's my problem with that. Here's my problem with that. And yes, LeBron is a freak, and he's whether he's the greatest player of all time or he's 1A, that's for our pal Skip Bayless to discuss ad nauseum. My question here would be, was there no veteran mentor that the Mavs ever brought in or did bring in or tried to bring in who could get the same message across to Luka? And if not, why didn't they try?
Oh, they tried really hard. They got what it calls a body team that works with him. Look, here's the difference.
But that's not an NBA. I mean,
But here's the difference, Evan. You remember when, and I've told this story 1,000 times, when the Rangers sent Bobby Witt down, and he just wasn't getting it. There's great talent, but he wasn't getting it.
It's in the message, right? It's all in the message.
And they sent him down, and Bobby Valentine was ticked off because Bobby came back and pitched really well, and we all gave the OKC people all kinds of credit for it. And Bobby said to this group of writers, what did they tell him that we didn't tell him? And I could, even then, as a stupid young baseball writer at the time, I thought to myself, well, it's because Ferguson Jenkins told him that. That's why. That's the difference. Well, that's the difference here. Luka knows how good he is. That's why he plays with such chutzpah out there, is that he knows he's an all-time player. Who's he going to listen to except for another all-time player? You know, Kyrie Irving was good for Luka, but I think Kyrie was a little reluctant to try to push that too much. Look, Kyrie's been a great teammate. And that's the thing that has kind of floored everybody here, is what a great teammate he has been. And I don't think he wanted to push. I think he wanted to get along with Luka. He understood how good he was, and he didn't want to rock the boat too much in all of that. Now, LeBron's in a different situation, a different perspective. He's a greater player. You know, he's one of the top 2 or 3 players ever. So that makes a big difference. And that is going to, and hopefully, and I hope that Luka gets that. It will look awful to Mavericks fans if that's what happens, but I want to see him be the player he should be. Everybody should want that when you see greatness. So let's go back now to the point you were making earlier, which was what? What was that point, Evan?
I don't know. You got me off my game here. I look again. I mean, I think that just the two things here, and we've talked a lot about this. The only question that I still have remaining on this is, and I think you've addressed this in print, and I think you've addressed this here to some extent, is do you feel like Nico Harrison committed an act of hubris as a GM?
Yeah, that's what we were going to talk about. Yes, there's no question about it. But he did not do this without Jason Kidd's knowledge. The whole thing about him saying, oh, Jason didn't know about it. He may not have known about the particulars and how it was going down and all of that. But Nico does nothing without Jason knowing about it. You know, they're very tight. They talk a lot. I know that Jason has complained about these kind of things to him. The two of them watching this together, you know, they knew what was happening. The problem in all of this was that the position that Nico put himself in, and this goes back to my initial feelings about Nico, is that he did this deal with the Lakers and Rob Pelinka in particular because he knew Rob Pelinka. He had association with him when he worked for Nike, a long-standing relationship between them. He knew that Rob would not leak this story or leak this trade proposal as they were talking about it, and that was important to him. And because of that, that's why he made the deal with the Lakers. Well, the return was not good enough. If you're determined to trade one of the greatest players ever, you're going to get more than a really good two-way player, a rotational player, and 1 first-round draft pick. You've got to get, if you're going to do that, you got to get 2 or 3 first-round picks, because that's one of the problems for the Mavericks. They have no first-round picks to offer anybody else if they want to make a deal. They've got a couple, but they're way out there. So that's an issue. You didn't fix that part of the equation. You should have fixed that if you're going to do this. I mean, when, you know, the Minnesota, you know, they had the last Rudy Gobert trade, it was for 5 players and 4 first-round draft picks. That's for Rudy Gobert, a one-trick pony. You know, that's ridiculous. There was not nearly enough in the return. And by not opening it up to other teams, and if you're going to do this, it has to get out there. And of course, there's going to be a blowback about it. Once it gets out, there's a blowback, but you're getting the blowback anyway. You got it after the fact. So what's the difference? If you're going to do this, you got to let people know that, yes, he's available. You don't have to make an announcement, but you get it around the league and you shop it around with other teams, and you tell those other teams, if this gets out, you're out. You're not going to be part of the negotiations anymore. So you need to keep it in-house that we're doing this, because that's the only way you get any leverage with anybody in this deal. So that's the biggest, perhaps the biggest sin of it is that 1 is to have the hubris to do it. 2, not to be smart enough to say, I got to get out here and get as much as I can for this guy.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, I think when you narrow the field of potential trade partners, you limit your potential return. I also think the idea that Nico dealt with somebody he trusts is at best naive. Never trust your friends in sports management. They're competitors. They're looking to beat you. They're looking to to beat you. And
well, they know you better than anybody else, right?
Yep.
And so they're gonna probe those weaknesses in your personality to do that.
John Daniels is very, very good friends with AJ Preller. They never made a deal. And there's a reason for that, because AJ is very competitive, and the idea that AJ would potentially try and take advantage of that was I think a consideration sometimes. So that's my question there. I think the cut to the chase moment here, Kevin, is make sense of this for Mavs fans. Give me what this trade has to accomplish for Mavs fans to ultimately say, okay, it was at least a reasonable deal.
You got to get back to the finals and probably have to win the finals this year, not next year, because they're talking about being for the present, right? So if you're talking about being for the present, that means that you're going to have to, in the next 3 or 4 years, you got to make it to the finals at least a couple of times, and you got to win at least once.
This team is currently, what, 8th or 9th in the Western Conference?
Yeah, the 9th, I think. So, yeah, and it's not – they can certainly play better than that. They're a better team than that. They're a better team with Luka, clearly. They were one of the 4 best teams in the West, and they're probably still in the top 5 now. But the problem is they've made the Lakers better.
Yep.
That's the other issue in all of this, is that you traded – it's like, not quite the same thing, but it'd be like trading somebody to the Astros, trading Corey Seager to the Astros. That's kind of what this would be like. Why in the world would you do that? Why would you give the team that you're competing against, and a team that was kind of on its way down? The Lakers have been on their way down now for a while. Well, now you've revived them. You've revived that organization for the next 10 years. The Lakers always seem to do that, and that's why everybody always thinks that there's some kind of, conspiracy here. It's because all the great players they've ever had, the best players they've ever had, except for Magic, I guess, they traded for all of them. And they were always one-sided deals. And so, yeah, that might make you think that there was something going on there, but not really. I want to say also, before we get out of this Mavericks segment of the podcast, is that basketball people, they're not romantic about anything. I can remember when the Mavericks traded Jason Kidd, and I was talking to Butch Beard, one of the Mavericks assistants at the time, and that was a very arrogant bunch. And he just said, the guy can't shoot. And yes, that was true. That was a legitimate complaint. Kidd was not a great shooter. He made himself into a great 3-point shooter, but he was not a great shooter. But it was everything else that he did, because his skill level otherwise was so off the charts that's what made him a Hall of Fame point guard. And then, of course, developing his 3-point shot. But Butch Beard just didn't look at it that way. That was what happened back when, as I wrote the other day, when the Houston Rockets traded Elvin Hayes to the Bullets for Jack Marin. Elvin Hayes is one of the 3 or 4 best power forwards in the history of the game. Jack Marin made the All-Star team a couple of times. But the quote from Ray Patterson was, Tex Winter has a team concept here, and this guy fits that better. Because Elvin was a nut, and he complained about stuff all the time and didn't get along with his teammates, and so he goes to the Bullets, and they put up with him because he's a great talent, and they make it work because Wes Unseld made it work. But this is how crazy that was back then. When that trade was made and it was announced, and of course everybody knew about Elvin's history and his difficulties. And when Gene Shue, the Bullets coach, was asked, was this a strict 1-for-1 deal? Shue said, no, we got Elvin's psychiatrist too. So, that was at a press conference. I would have loved to have been working in press conferences back then when people would say stuff like that. So anyway, that's going to do it for the Mavericks segment of our podcast. This is going to be an ongoing thing, right? We're going to be talking about this trade and the ramifications of it for a long time. That's the one thing about being a sports writer in this market. You've always got some crazy team executive willing to do something like this and give us stuff to write about. Evan, we talked about the Super Bowl earlier, and now the Chiefs are back. I did not bet on the Chiefs. I thought that the Bills would certainly beat them, and they're just remarkable. They rise to the occasion better than any organization I can think of. Even when the Patriots were winning and dominating the NFL, it's because they have this great quarterback, this great system, a great head coach. It's all great, and they did really well. the Chiefs feel different for me. Not to say that that Andy Reid's not a great coach, and certainly Patrick Mahomes is a great quarterback, but Patrick's not played well this year. This has been his worst season by far, and yet here they are back in the Super Bowl again. It's just that, like Luka, he just rises to the occasion. He just knows that he can do what needs to be done when it has to be done, and now they're back again. And I won't.
Well, maybe to quote Tex Winters, who was the GM of the?
No, he was the head coach. Tex Winter, not Winters. Winter. He was a great coach.
Was Abe Lemons, but not Abe Lemon, and Tex Winter.
Well, are you comparing people's names now?
No, I can't even remember. This is Kevin. This is ancient history again. This is like Paleolithic.
Wow.
But to that point, right? Maybe the Chiefs just have a great team concept. I do think Andy Reid doesn't. It's hard to say this, but I don't think Andy Reid gets enough credit for what he's done as a head coach. I think he's an outstanding head coach. I think he's one of the all-time greats, and I'm sure that he's been moved into that window. But I think we've all kind of looked at it like, well, there's Belichick, there's Lombardi, and then there's Landry, and there's everybody else, or Chuck Noll, and then there's everybody else. I think Andy Reid belongs in that top five, and I mean he's got a team in position, and I know I just talked about a coach or a manager or a GM thinking that they're too important. I don't think Andy has ever thought he's too important, but I do think that, listen, they're on the verge of doing something unprecedented. And I think that the coach does deserve some credit for that, particularly because he sets the environment.
Yeah, I would put Andy would be in my top 10, not my top 5, probably. I have renewed respect for Joe Gibbs for winning all 3 of his.
Gibb or Gibbs? Is he plural or singular?
I love the fact that this is what this has devolved to, is we're deciding whether guys are plural or singular, because he did it with different quarterbacks. But that's the case. Every great coach has to have a great quarterback. I guess you can make the argument that Bart Starr wasn't great; he was just really good. And Bob Greasy wasn't great; he was just really good. And then Don Shula was, maybe a better coach than that. But of course, the Bill Belichick argument always is that, what was he without Tom Brady? Well, he wasn't very much. He wasn't really good in Cleveland, and he wasn't good after Brady left. I do think it does show, as you said earlier, when we were talking about, executives, it's the players who make it. In the end, it is the player. Now, you have to have the right person putting it all together. There's no question about that. But in the end, it's the players first. I would always say that. It's players first, coaches second. Except maybe here with the Cowboys, where if you have to have the great coach to make up for the GM being such a nut. So that's a little different story. For the Chiefs to win 3 in a row, I think someone pointed out this to me the other day, that the Packers actually won 3 championships in a row, just not 3 Super Bowls, because their first championship was before.
They bridged into the Super Bowl era.
Correct. So, but I'm not betting against the Chiefs. I mean, I think that the Eagles do a lot of good things. The difference though between Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts, that's a huge difference. And Jalen does some nice things, and he's a good quarterback. But Patrick is at this point a Hall of Fame quarterback.
I think that's kind of my belief too. I think the Eagles are a really good team, but I also just can't bet against the Chiefs, not at this stage, not after what they've done. And I think the other thing for me here is, from the start of this season, it was very clear that the AFC was a superior conference to the NFC, top to bottom. And I think that, you're going to take one of these 2 teams. I'm going to take the AFC team. They've played the tougher opponents. They've beaten the tougher opponents, and they're the better conference this year.
Well, that's where all the quarterbacks are too. I mean, if you look at, the NFC quarterbacks just way behind what they are in the AFC. The Bills were the hottest team in the league. They were the story of the 24 season. When it came down to it, the Chiefs just shut them down. They're just remarkable how they're able to do that. And I don't think you can, you can't overemphasize how much it's meant to have the experience they have. The fact that they've been there, and won, and they know what to do, and that those other teams, how much doubt do you think has to have crept into the Bills' mind now at this point? They have to think we're the Marv Levy teams all over again. We get here and we just can't get over the hump. That is one huge chip on those guys' shoulders. I feel bad for those Bills.
Yeah, but listen, I've always looked at those Bills teams and before that, that generation of Vikings teams. And I know it's frustrating to not have won a Super Bowl, but in my mind, I try and look, they've played a dynastic type of team. They've run into a dynastic team over and over again in this Chiefs team. And it's not about the Bills' inadequacy in any way for me. It is about just what a great job the Chiefs have done and what a truly historic organization they have become.
Yeah, they have that. It's really remarkable, isn't it? This is the team that left Dallas, of course, the Dallas Texans, and the Chiefs have, there have been times in the 60s they were great. I can remember for whatever reason, I became a huge Chiefs fan in the 60s in Houston. And I was fascinated by the fact that they had been so good and then they weren't, right? That there was a long time when the Chiefs were no good. And I remember going back and looking at their drafts, and that was all you needed to see. And that goes back to the point I was making before. They just weren't drafting good players anymore. And you can pretty much look at any team in the NFL, especially because of the parity in the league. And because of the salary cap and what that has wrought. If you're not drafting well, if you're not consistently not only taking, let's say, from a 7-round draft, if 3 or 4 of those guys are not making your rosters, and if 2 or 3 of them are not Pro Bowl players, you're not going to be winning anything. You have to consistently be doing that, and especially in the salary cap era, because you can't pay those players anymore, right? That's what the Cowboys are running into now. They hit it, unbelievably well on Micah Parsons, and they did really well on CeeDee Lamb. But now they're going to have to pay those guys, and so now 3 guys, those 2 guys, and Dak Prescott are going to. I think the last thing I saw was they're going to be like 40% of the Cowboys cap, in 3 players. And so that's why you have to draft well. The Cowboys are going to have to really draft well this spring. They're going to have to hit, I was reading Calvin Watkins' draft analysis today, and Calvin seems to gravitate toward the thought that their main need is a defensive tackle in the first round. And I don't know that I disagree with him. I've said before about drafting Ashton Genty, and I could certainly see the temptation to do that because he's a home run hitter, and you get him, and that goes a long way toward fixing your offensive game, your running game. And clearly they want to run the ball more than they did under Mike McCarthy. I think as they point out, everybody says that, nobody does it. But I do think that is what they want to do now because they saw the value of it in the NFL this year. But the Chiefs, or the Eagles, I don't know why I keep doing that. The Eagles are built around drafting linemen, offensive or defensive, more defensive. As you know, Evan, they have taken a lot of Georgia players. And that is so important to do that, to get that quality up front. And the Cowboys just, for all the things they've done right since Will McClay has been in charge of the draft since 2014, they've drafted offensive linemen really well. They've gotten a couple of linebackers who were pretty good, maybe better than good, like in Micah Parsons. They have drafted cornerbacks well. They've done a lot of good things. They have not drafted good defensive tackles. Mozzie Smith was a disaster. Taco Charlton was a disaster, although I guess he was a defensive end, but a defensive lineman. Osa Odigizua, who is a free agent now, is probably the best defensive lineman they've drafted. I don't even remember what round they got him in. But this team has to pay more attention to that. Forever we have talked about the fact that the Cowboys can't stop the run, and now if they want, It depends on who's available. So Mason Graham, big defensive tackle from Michigan, everybody's consensus, the best defensive lineman in the draft. He'll be gone before they pick at 12.
And I don't want to oversimplify Howie Roseman's strategy, but listen, you could, if you wanted to, you could oversimplify this, right? That you could say, boy, it sure does look like the Eagles have said, well, let's take a bunch of the best players from the best defense in college football in Georgia and take a bunch of other players who are skill position players from the previous dynasty, the University of Alabama. And that might oversimplify it a little, but it also does explain a lot. You know, it's not a bad idea to get the best players from the best programs year after year.
No, I don't think there's any question about that either. I agree with you 100%. I don't understand, although if you watch football games and they do that thing where they introduce the players and they all say where they came from, and some of them like to say silly things like where they went to high school. I'm always blown away by the number of players who come from these tiny programs. And I'm not saying that you can't find a good player from those programs, but you're taking a real chance with them because people look really good against lighter competition, right? I want a player who's already played against this kind of competition. That's NFL caliber talent. Then I can make a better judgment about him. That's what we get in the CFP, right? When we watch that, you watch these games. And look what Indiana did this year. They were terrific. Well, they played a light schedule, and then what happened when they got in the playoffs? Boom, they're out. And in the end, the most talented team in college football won. They had the most talent. They're playing in the biggest league. They won. That's what you need to be judging yourself against.
I agree. I mean, listen, I've long felt that the industry of the NFL draft has overanalyzed itself to death, particularly on the first round picks. And I don't think it's that hard because the level of play that you're drafting at the NFL level is higher than in any other league, right? I mean, the closer that guys are to contributing in the NFL than they are to any other league. And yet there seems to be far more minutia put into the formula of how these players are evaluated and drafted. And I think that sometimes it takes hey, let's think a little bit less and let's let the play dictate for us. Now, look, I mean, there's certainly cases of guys that you see out there that you thought were going to be actual NFL monsters. I mean, for me, the best defensive player that I had seen in the last 20 years was probably Ndamukong Suh. He's been a fine NFL player and he's had a long NFL career. Was he the best player in that draft? Was he the best defensive player in that draft? No. I mean, so there's levels at which you were going to miss, but I don't think a team would have been who drafted Suh out of college? Was it the Lions?
You know what? That's a good question. I can't remember.
But
he's moved around.
He's not. He was certainly not a bust wherever he was taken in that draft. And my point is, look, there are some guys that you're going to hit home runs on, right? Nobody would have. Patrick Mahomes was an absolute home run, and that's great. But you need to make sure you're not paralyzing yourself by overanalysis in this draft.
Oh, no question about it. It goes back to what you were saying earlier about Luka, and I agree with that 100%. When you're so close to somebody all the time, and you get used to them, and you take things for granted, and then you undervalue those things because you're doing that, and that's what they're doing here. I can't tell you the number of people who would complain to me about Luka, all the time. People who think they know a lot about basketball, and they say
it's frustrating. It was frustrating for everybody to watch. I mean,
it's silly for people to complain too much about these things, because then when those people are gone, because they have established that, it's a little bit like Corey Seager's the same thing, right? Because he's not a great defensive shortstop, but he's an adequate one. And then we see what he does in the playoffs, and you think you want him to do that all the time. It's like that's a little hard.
Yeah.
That's a little hard to carry that kind of level. That's not just Hall of Fame level. The way he played in that season, that was upper tier Hall of Fame.
I just go back to a conversation I had with Ron Washington, his first year managing, and I had gotten to know Wash a little bit in 2006 when he was with the A's, and then came to the Rangers and spent that first winter and spring talking about, what a player can do and believing in players. And then he fell into the same trap that so many managers and coaches do when they get in. You start focusing, and maybe you hear from your scouts on what a player can't do. And I had a conversation with him at one point in time, and I was like, this doesn't sound like the Ron Washington that I saw, right? Or that I heard in the first few months of managing. You're focusing on what guys can't do. And I do think that over the next 3 years, that was something that Wash really got back to, was let me focus on what guys can do. Let me make the most out of what I have instead of focusing on what they can't. And I think that's part of how he got the most out of the teams that he got so much out of.
So you were the Wash whisperer?
No, I was not the Wash whisperer, but I it was something, and it's not like I considered a conversation. I probably said it, and he was probably like, listen, I got other things to do. I got this heater to smoke. Can you get away from me? But I do think that it was an observation on my part that was somewhat salient. And I do think that whether it was John Daniels or other people in the front office, I do think they made the same point to him that, don't focus on what these guys can't do. The reason we hired you is because you can get the most out of what they can do. And I do think he got back to that.
Yeah, except now he's with the Angels, and that's hard to focus on the good there.
Yep.
That's not good. Not good. All right, that's going to do it for the I don't know what we're going to call that segment. It's not really the Super Bowl segment. It was a little bit of everything.
It was you know what it was, Kevin?
The old potpourri?
It was the weave. It was the weave. We did a weave.
Don't go there. Don't go there. All right. So now we're going to wrap this up by talking about the Rangers. You're going to spring training next week. Is that right?
I'm leaving a week from today. Yeah, I'm going to Arizona February 11th for some spring training.
Wow.
Yeah,
That'll be
here.
fun. It's here. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
It's here, and another winter has come and gone, and I've said, how the hell did I waste it? Every year, like around August, I'm like, all right, I'm going to remake my life when October comes around. Everything's going to be great, going to be a life-changing event, and then it gets to spring training, and I'm like, yeah, I need some more Oreos.
Yeah. Well, Evan, I tell you what, it's going to be interesting to see what the Rangers do this year. I'm intrigued by a lot of things. One of them is this Bruce Bochy's last year as the manager of the Rangers, which I think is a legitimate question here with the you've got a manager in waiting, right there on staff, not on staff, but in the organization. So there's that, and how much he really wants to do it. There's the issue of players rebounding. You would expect there to be a certain level of that after such an awful season, almost across the board. We can almost go around the entire diamond, and everybody was played below the level they should have, and so you would expect some of that to happen. And then obviously they're going in without a proven closer this year. I don't expect that will end up being the case as we go deep into the season. But here's the thing I want to ask you about, because this is, to me, the one thing that no one's really taken seriously, and I don't know that you really should. There should always be a grain of salt with this. But what if Jacob deGrom actually does come back and pitch like Jacob deGrom can for an entire season?
Yeah, I mean, I look, I think that's in the back of everybody's mind. I just don't think that the Rangers or anybody wants to go in saying we're going to expect him to throw 160 plus innings and make 25 starts. I do think that there's going to be a slow ramp up for Jacob deGrom, and I think that you may see in April, you may see some pretty short starts for him as the Rangers continue to build him up. But listen, for me, here's a guy who came back last September throwing 97 to 100. He came out and everything was sharp. He is a freak. But I guess what I'm saying is he's a freak. And if he's healthy, I don't put anything past him. And even if you get 150 innings out of Jacob deGrom, which still might be the high end, he might still be the best pitcher in the league at 150 innings. So, my thought is that the Rangers will probably go into the season with, I think Nathan Eovaldi will start the season opener, and I think Jacob will probably start game number 2. But I do feel like the rebound for what Jacob deGrom can be versus the rebound for what other guys can be is just higher. This is a multi-time Cy Young Award winner. So if he does rebound to where he was previously or close to it, the Rangers have one of the 3 best pitchers in baseball. Maybe
well,
the
there's
best.
no question about that. I think that's what one of the analytics, I don't remember which one it was, projected him a 5.1 WAR. Was that what I saw? That somewhere that he would, and that made him like the 3rd or 4th best pitcher in the game, I think.
Yeah, I think, yes, I'm not going to go deep into thoughts on WAR and particularly WAR on pitchers, but look, he's a really good pitcher. By any metric that you want to measure, when he's on the mound, he's a really good pitcher. And if the Rangers can count on him, and if the Rangers can count on innings throughout the rotation, they've got a really good rotation, and it's a significant change. I think the one thing, and I was talking to some Rangers people yesterday, the one thing that I'm kind of stuck on that I'm gonna write a column on this at some point in time. I just don't know how we actually evaluate this, but what was the Rangers' single biggest problem in 2024, Kevin?
Well, the single biggest?
Single biggest.
Couldn't
if you
hit.
were picking out one thing that the Rangers did really poorly last year, what would it be?
Hit
fastballs.
Yeah, I hit fastballs in particular, yeah, but hit. Yeah.
And they're going to spend 6 weeks in Arizona, right? With questions about how do you hit fastballs better. And the bottom line is when they get out of Arizona, I don't think they're going to have any idea if they've made any adjustments on fastballs because guys aren't throwing as hard, right? They aren't throwing as much. Their pitch sequencing is going to be much more rudimentary than it would be in the regular season. And so I think that they're going into spring with their single biggest on-field project going to be one that you really can't get a good answer to in spring training. So that's something that I'm going to be interested to see how that plays out. But that's certainly a big area for them. And I do think in terms of personnel, it's something that they made a really strategic effort to address this offseason with the acquisitions of Jake Berger and Jock Peterson.
Yeah, those are going to be difference makers. And I think that, and I certainly appreciate you pointing that out, because if you look at what the national writers have said, I see people saying that, well, really, Jake Berger's not an upgrade over, Nate Lowe at first base, and because of his OPS and this and that, and because of he's not as good a defensive first baseman and all that. And it's like, but just what we talked about all along, Nate at his best could never hit a fastball. He might poke it into left field, and there's nothing wrong with that, except that what you really got to have is you got to have a first baseman who drives the ball. And I think that I see Jake Berger as a huge upgrade over Nate at first base.
And listen, I'm not saying I don't want it to come across that this is an upgrade necessarily over Nate Lowe. I think it's an upgrade over what this team didn't do well last year, which was hit fastballs. That was a weakness in Nate's game. It was a weakness across the board. I think that they needed a couple of better fastball hitters, and they certainly need Evan Carter and Josh Young back in the lineup, 2 guys who I think have the ability to hit fastballs. And then maybe that makes it a little bit more realistic to think that Adolis Garcia is going to get more pitches that he can handle instead of A, swinging out of his butt, trying to catch up to fastballs, or B, just being not really having a game plan going up there. And I think that also, maybe it takes a little bit of pressure off Marcus Semien. And so I think that you may see like some degrees of nuance of improvement in other places along the way. And maybe Jake Berger doesn't go to 850 or 900 on the OPS scale, but I do think you're going to see an overall improvement in the offense. And I think that's going to make a big difference.
I don't think you couldn't help but have an improvement. I don't know if they're going to go back to what they were in 2023, but I think they are a more balanced offense now. I think the problems to me, looking back on all that, is that they made Jonah Heim play too much, and I think he suffered into that. I like the idea of having him playing more of a 50-50 split here at catcher and the pairs. I think that'll be good for Jonah. I do, I like the team has always been too lefty dominated anyway, and I do like the fact that they have added, a right-handed power hitter. I think that's always a good thing. I think in the lineup, I do think that Wyatt Langford finally at the end of last year lived up to the promise that we all saw in spring training, and everybody thought he was just going to walk right into the season and keep playing that way, and that didn't happen. But he made adjustments. He's certainly extremely athletic. I loved it when Sebastian Walcott said that, well, we all called him Mike Trout, because that's what he looks like. I'm not saying he's going to be Mike Trout. He doesn't have to be. If he was 75% of Mike Trout, that's great. And so we'll see what he can do. I'm just really intrigued by Adolis, because if they can't get Adolis going, at least something approaching what he was in 2023, that's going to be an issue, and they're going to have to find it, because you cannot have that dead spot. If he's been pushed back to sixth, I really think he probably should be hitting sixth now. I think anything higher than that puts too much pressure on him, and you move him back a little bit, and if he's not going to hit, he certainly can't be hitting fourth or fifth. Sixth might be too high for him at some point. He has to return to a level of confidence. I think he completely lost his confidence last year, maybe because of this extra movement he's had that they said they've worked on. He was not achieving at the levels he wanted to, and I just think that he, mentally went in the tank. And when he is the emotional heart of your team, that's what, Corey Seager even said that. And if he's down there sulking, not playing as well in right field either, I mean, he wasn't nearly as effective or as good last year as he'd been in previous years. Then that's a drag on this team, because before, we didn't have the Rangers didn't have anybody else to pick that up. Not from a emotional standpoint. Now, maybe they do now. Maybe now Berger and Jock Peterson, who's a real character, maybe those guys change the temperament of the clubhouse, and that will be interesting to see. That is one thing you can tell from spring training, right, Evan?
I think, look, I think you can get some indications, and I think you can get some different energy going into the season, but chemistry is something that develops over the season, and the team in 2023 and how good their chemistry was at the end of the season was certainly it certainly evolved from the start of the year. I think they were in a good place going into the start of the year, but I think they got into a great place by the end of the year. I think that the same thing could potentially exist this year. I think they'll be in a good place going into the season. I don't know if they were in a good place going into last season, and this is all maybe revisionist history, but it certainly looks like a team that was weighed down with the burden of being a defending champion.
Yeah, and I think that comes a little bit from the personalities, right? You got to have the personality to sustain that kind of thing. And I think that what we can tell of a guy like, especially of Jock Peterson, is that, yeah, he's got the personality for that. But that only works if he's a good player. If he's a contributing player, if he's going to be a good DH and be solid from that standpoint, then people listen to you. People always want you to add someone to a lineup or to a roster who's going to, be a leader. Well, you can only be a leader if you're a player too. I don't know very many players in the history of any sport who really weren't any good anymore, who had a significant impact emotionally and mentally on a club.
Agreed.
All right, that's going to do it for our podcast this week. We thank you for listening. We'll be back next week, and maybe David will be back and talk about the Super Bowl, what happened there. We'll also see, the trade deadline isn't until Thursday. Maybe the Mavericks are going to make another deal. They don't have much to move around at this point, although who knows? Lord knows what they might trade now, but we'll see what happens there, and we'll have more to talk about. So from everybody in here to everybody out there, thanks, and we'll see you next time.